Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most emotionally charged, yet profoundly misunderstood topics in human history, the global record of slavery. Now, we aren't here to attack a specific religion, defend any empire, or assign collective guilt. Instead, we have one core focus: to provide all the evidence. We're going to look honestly and impartially at the historical record across continents and civilizations to truly understand how the enslavement of human beings was practiced, justified, and how it ultimately evolved over the centuries. To do that, we've got a clear roadmap ahead. We'll be looking at slavery in the Bible, slavery in the Quran, the Arab slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism in modern markets, and finally, the legacy of slavery. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Slavery in the Bible. What the Old and New Testaments actually say. So, what does the Bible actually say about the institution of slavery? This is a crucial starting point because we have to separate our modern assumptions from the actual written scriptures. It's really easy to assume that because modern faith traditions strongly condemn slavery, their ancient text must have done exactly the same thing. But to really grasp the history, we have to look directly at the primary source evidence and ask, what's actually on the page? Take a look at Leviticus 25. The text says, "You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life." This isn't a loose paraphrase. This is the exact text showing that the Old Testament explicitly permitted permanent chattel slavery for foreigners. It clearly states that Israelites could buy slaves from the surrounding nations, that these individuals became their literal property, and that they could be passed down to their children as an inheritance. That is the very definition of permanent chattel slavery, enshrined right there in the text. What we see here is that the Old Testament didn't abolish slavery. Instead, it heavily regulated it as a recognized institution of its time. The text lays out specific rules for buying, inheriting, and even disciplining slaves. For instance, Exodus 21 mentions that if a master beats a slave and that slave survives a day or two before dying, the master isn't punished because the enslaved person is considered his property or his money. If you read through these passages, nowhere in the Old Testament is the institution of slavery universally condemned. And this framework carries forward into the New Testament. In Ephesians chapter 6, we see the Apostle Paul explicitly instructing slaves to obey their masters, which shows us that early Christianity didn't abolish the practice either. Even Jesus frequently used slavery as a metaphor in his parables without stopping to condemn the institution itself. Here, Paul tells slaves to submit to their masters with the same respect, fear, and sincerity of heart that they would give to Christ. So providing all the evidence means acknowledging there simply is no blanket abolition of slavery in these foundational texts. Now let's apply that exact same objective standard to the Islamic faith. Section 2, Slavery in the Quran, examining the Islamic texts and hadith. Just like we did with the Bible, we have to ask, does the Quran explicitly abolish the practice of slavery? We need to look closely at what the text says about those whom your right hands possess, which is the Quranic phrase for enslaved people. Did this text issue a definitive, hard stop to human bondage when it emerged in the 7th century? The short answer is no, but it's nuanced. While Islamic texts heavily encouraged freeing slaves and strictly mandated good treatment, these still regulated the institution, rather than outright abolishing it. The Quran and Hadith operated on the assumption that slavery was a reality. They permitted the enslavement of war captives and allowed for sexual relations with female slaves. But importantly, a major emphasis in these texts was the virtue of manumission. Freeing a slave was considered a deeply righteous act, and the text even provided specific legal mechanisms for slaves to actually earn their freedom. When we map the evidence from both traditions side by side, some pretty undeniable similarities emerge. Neither the biblical nor the Quranic texts issued a blanket abolition. And why is that? Well, it's because both of these traditions emerged in ancient societies where slavery was already a deeply entrenched foundational part of the economic and social fabric. They both regulated it, and they both provided varying ethical frameworks to manage it, but neither completely dismantled it in their foundational scriptures. Let's shift our focus from scripture to scale. Section 3, the Arab slave trade. Scope, scale, and historical realities. Historians estimate a truly staggering number here. Anywhere between 6 to 12 million African captives were transported during the Arab slave trade. Now, exact figures are notoriously difficult to pin down because of incomplete documentation, but the sheer scale is undeniable. These brutal trade routes stretched across the expanses of the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, operating continuously over many, many centuries. And it's absolutely vital to note that this was a massive, multi-ethnic enterprise. The evidence clearly shows participation was not limited to just one group. It involved Muslim Arabs and Berbers, African rulers who captured and sold rival prisoners, local intermediaries, and depending on the era, even European and Jewish participants. The historical reality we're looking at is a vast, complex economic network of human exploitation that crossed multiple religious and ethnic lines.
Next, we have to examine the massive, highly racialized slave system created by European empires in the Americas. Section 4, the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, and plantation slavery.
12.5 million. This is the estimated number of Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean between the 16th and 19th centuries. Out of those 12.5 million souls, roughly 10.7 million survived the unimaginable horrors of the Middle Passage, a journey defined by severe overcrowding, rampant disease, and extreme violence. Those who survived were then forced into brutal plantation slavery, quite literally building the global economies of sugar, cotton, and tobacco. This specific era was defined by a complex, global tragedy that fundamentally reshaped the modern world. European shipping, finance, and imperial ambition were the engines driving this massive demand. Meanwhile, African societies on the coast and further inland played varying, complex roles. Sometimes they acted as powerful intermediaries organizing the capture and supply of slaves, sometimes they were fierce resistors, and, tragically, in the millions, they were the victims of this intensely racialized system. To ensure we are providing all the evidence, we also have to trace how these systems evolved into forced labor and modern trafficking. Section 5, Colonialism and Modern Markets, from the Congo to contemporary Libya. Just look at how this timeline stretches across centuries, adapting to new systems. You go from the jarring reality of early English slave ships, literally named Jesus, to the official closure of the massive Zanzibar slave market in 1873. But it doesn't end there. We then see the catastrophic colonial violence of King Leopold's Congo Free State, where an estimated 10 million people perished under a forced rubber labor system that functioned exactly like slavery. And that brings us all the way up to 2017, where horrifying footage surfaced revealing migrant slave auctions happening in modern-day Libya. This timeline is stark proof that exploitation is a continuous, global human issue. It just morphs into new forms. So let's bring all this evidence together to understand why viewing this complete historical dossier matters so much today. Section 6, the legacy of slavery, avoiding double standards in history. If we're going to criticize the slavery of one civilization or one religion, we absolutely must apply that exact same rigorous standard to all of them. Why? Because the evidence shows that this tragic history belongs to all of humanity. Slavery wasn't invented by one race. It was practiced in ancient Mesopotamia and Rome just as it was in the Middle East and the Americas. The foundational texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all regulated the practice. States across Europe, the Arab world, and Africa all profited heavily from it. We aren't looking at this to inherit the guilt of our ancestors, but rather to gain a true impartial historical understanding based on all the facts. When we strip away the double standards and impartially look at all the evidence, we're left staring at a universal human vulnerability to exploit one another. So I want to leave you with this final thought. If the evidence shows slavery was a universal human institution, how do we use this complete, unvarnished history to combat the exploitation that still exists in our world today? Thanks for joining me for this